For part 2 of this week's video, we will return to this graph in a moment, but I think the marginal revenue line might be clearer using this next graph. So I'm going to show you this for just a minute because this one's a little bit easier with the calculations. So if you can see here, at a price of 150, this monopolist would sell 1 unit. All right, so price of 150, quantity sold would be 1 unit, and total revenue you can see is 150, right? But marginal revenue is also 150, right? So that first unit marginal revenue and price are equal. But if this monopolist lowers the price to say 125, right, you can see that they're going to sell 2 units, right? At a price of 125, they will sell 2 units. Their total revenue, which again is calculated right here, is 250. But you can see that the marginal revenue drops much more quickly than the price. The price fell to 125, but the marginal revenue, or the change in total revenue, is only 100, right? So you can see each time the monopolist drops the price, the marginal revenue drops even more quickly. Until we get to this point right here, right, where marginal revenue becomes 0, right? We move, and this is that hypothetical range of unit elasticity. Really, there's just one point of unit elasticity, which would be right in the middle here, right? At a price somewhere around, I don't even know, 82 or something, and 3.5 units sold, that will be the maximum total revenue. So you can see that the monopolist's marginal revenue curve is going to diverge from its demand curve. You can also see from this particular slide that the monopolist, like any one facing a demand curve, has ranges of elasticity. The important piece here is that the monopolist would never willingly produce in this range. The monopolist would never lower the price to a point where their marginal revenue, the revenue of the next unit sold, is actually negative, right? It would actually reduce their total revenue. They're not going to do that. Okay, let's go back to this graph for just a moment because this one's better for understanding the monopolist behavior. At the bottom here, it just says this graph may or may not include the ABC line. It always includes the marginal revenue line. We don't really need to see that. What we want to see is what decision does this monopolist make? How much output will this monopolist produce, and what will they charge for it? So the monopolist is going to produce just like anybody else does at the point where MR equals MC. So look at the graph for a minute and see if you can see that point. Okay, it's going to be right here, right, where MR crosses MC. So you take that down to the x-axis and you can see, okay, this is the quantity that the monopolist will produce. We'd like to think, oh, and they'll charge this price, right? But that's not the case. The monopolist will charge the most they can. So how can we find the monopolist price? Very simple. Go up to the demand curve. If they want to sell Q1 units of output, they want to set the price at a place where the consumers will buy Q1 units of output. And that price just happens to be right here, right? Okay, so we know the monopolist will produce Q1 units of output and sell for P1. Is the monopolist making a profit? Yes. Again, we compare the price that they're selling it to the average total cost of production. Okay, and then we can draw a line there and we can say here's the monopolist profit. Unlike the perfect competitor, when the monopolist is making a profit, they don't have to worry about other firms entering the market and taking away their profits, decreasing the price, because no one else can enter, right? They might have a patent or they have some way of keeping the competition out. So that's the difference between monopolist and perfect competition. The monopolist doesn't face a market supply curve, right? And they're able to keep other firms out. So if they have profits, they can maintain them. Now, a monopolist is not guaranteed a profit. You can imagine a situation where the ATC curve is, for example, up here, right? If this is the ATC curve, they might be a monopolist, right? But it doesn't really matter because the average total cost of production, right? Marginal revenue crosses marginal cost here. They can sell for this amount, but it costs this amount to produce each unit. Okay, that monopolist is taking a loss, and they would just go out of business. All right, we've already looked at this slide. So let's go ahead to the case of perfect price discrimination. Price discrimination means that the monopolist, or, and this can actually apply to an oligopolist too, anybody who has some type of market power. It means that they can charge each buyer exactly the amount that they are willing to pay. And I faded the MR line here, but I want you to see that the MR line is actually going to disappear. There really is no marginal revenue line for a perfect price discriminating monopolist. And the reason is this. Okay, before when we said, well, what was total revenue as they lowered the price, right? Let's say this monopolist lowers the price. Let's say this price is 80, right? And they sell 1 unit, so their total revenue is 80. and they want to sell a second unit, so they lower the price on that unit to 75. Total revenue is now 80 plus 75, right? Because they don't actually have to lower the price on both units, because they're able to charge each buyer exactly what they're willing to pay. So they can sell to the first person for 80, the second person for 75, the third person for 70, the next one for 65, and rather than having to lower the price on all units and see that marginal revenue drop steeply, okay, they just lower the price on the next unit. So the demand curve is also the marginal revenue curve. So where will the perfect price discriminating monopolist produce? They'll produce where the demand curve, which as I said is also the marginal revenue curve, where that crosses MC. And interestingly, this is sort of the same place, right, that a perfectly competitive firm would, because marginal cost represents the supply curve. So a perfect price discriminating monopolist is actually allocatively efficient. Are monopolists productively efficient? No, we know that because they don't produce at the minimum point of ATC, right? In neither case, this case over here, okay, I'll go back to here, they were producing to the left of minimum ATC, right? This is where minimum ATC is, and in this case, they're actually producing to the right. Okay, so in neither case are they productively efficient, but they are, if they can perfectly price discriminate, they're actually allocatively efficient. Really, we wouldn't have this jerky little graph, right? That's just sort of representing if we could isolate each individual purchaser. But what we draw normally, and again, ignore the marginal revenue line, okay? The way we draw perfect price discriminating monopoly is like this, okay? So that we shade in that whole area. The interesting thing is that the monopolist also manages to take all of the surplus, right? Consumers have no surplus because everybody's paying exactly what they're willing to pay. Okay, a few little notes on second and third degree price discrimination, which are less important but could come up in Econ Challenge. Second degree price discrimination and third degree price discrimination are not nearly as, shall we say, illegal as first degree price discrimination. Second degree price discrimination is when a monopolist offers discounts to people who buy in bulk. So think Sam's Club. All right, think of those big superstores where you don't just buy one roll of paper towels, you buy 30 rolls of paper towels. And they sell at a lower price to people who are willing to buy in bulk. So what this monopolist does is they have one price up here for the individual purchaser and one price down here for the bulk purchaser. And that way they're able to hit two different markets, right, without having to lower this price for the individual. So, we'll charge you $2 for one roll of paper towels, or we'll charge you $20 for 15 rolls of paper towels. And that incentivizes people who are willing to buy in bulk and take on the storage costs. Third degree price discrimination is more like what airlines do. So they're able to segregate buyers into separate markets with different demand curves. And you can see this demand curve is very inelastic. This one's pretty elastic. Okay, this would represent, for example, the business traveler who has to go on a trip. And this would represent the casual, vacationer who doesn't really have to go on a trip. So because they're able to isolate them into different markets, and they do that strategically by charging different fares to people who stay over Saturday night, because business travelers they know aren't going to stay over Saturday night, and vacationers generally do. So what they do is they charge a higher price to people whose demand is more inelastic, and a lower price to people whose demand is more elastic. Okay, it's not perfect because a business traveler, of course, can be savvy and say, I'll put myself into that market of vacationers, I'll stay over Saturday night, and there's no way to isolate and identify them, and then they can get the lower price as well. So what is wrong with monopoly? This will be our last slide for this week. Monopolists charge a price that is higher than would be charged in perfect competition. They restrict output, so they produce less than would be produced in perfect competition. They reduce total surplus, and they actually create a deadweight loss because they produce a lesser amount. And let's go back for a moment here to that monopoly graph so we can see that point. Okay, here we are. So the perfectly competitive market would produce where supply crosses demand, and like I said, marginal cost is sort of a miniature version of supply. So a perfectly competitive market would produce right here. So they would produce more output, right, and they would charge a lower price, because this is the price being charged by the monopolist. So monopolist produces less output and charges more for it. And the deadweight loss they create is right here. Okay, that's what should be created if this were a perfectly competitive market. So they're allocatively inefficient, they're productively inefficient. They make a lot of profits for themselves, but they're not really good for consumers. They underallocate resources because they're allocatively inefficient. So what can be done? We'll talk a little bit more about regulation with natural monopoly next week. We can pursue antitrust charges, so we can do things like the Sherman Antitrust Act and try to break up monopolies. They split up some monopolies, like, for example, the phone company was broken up in the 1970s. We can also ignore monopolies and let them function. And we can regulate them. In other words, we can require them to have, we can limit them by either price or profit. So we can give them a cap on what they can charge, or we can put a limit on the amount of profits they can get. So we'll come back to regulation next time.